Thank you.
All right. It's really a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Iva Ivanova for our e-colloquium. Dr. Ivanova is assistant professor at University of Texas in El Paso, where she's been since 2016, and she runs the Language and Communication Lab there. Before traveling to Texas, Dr. Ivanova completed postdoctoral research at UC San Diego. Following the completion of her PhD in 2010, University of Barcelona. Her research spans a broad range of topics that, well, you guys know me, are so fascinating. And I could dig into any one of them and really get lost, but I need to keep this very short so we have plenty of time for Dr. Ivanova to talk to us about what's most interesting. Her research broadly engages with how people produce and understand language. This includes a focus on more complicated and, dare I say, more natural experimental settings, like investigating connected speech and dialogue. I noticed a note on her lab website mentioning that they're moving towards, or maybe have already established, a virtual reality setup to facilitate some of this research. Really exciting stuff. That focus has been merged or engages also with a long time interest in issues of communication, specifically to multilingual, bilingual individuals, including the much studied topic of executive function and control in that population. She's a recent recipient of an NSF grant, so congrats on that, by the way, saw that. And has her research appears in a wide range of top exciting venues, journals like Cognition, Journal of Memory Language, Bilingualism, and so forth. There's a lot more I could say going through the rich CV, but I don't want to take up any more time. I want to welcome Dr. Ivanova and thank her for joining us today.
Thank you so much, John, for this really nice introduction. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I must say that the website reflects a little bit a transition in my thinking, and it reflects a little bit, I don't want to call it wishful thinking because it's happening, but what I'm going to show you today hasn't reached yet that point. Here you will see though really the transitioning of my work towards more traditionally established types of experiments and this connected speech stuff that is still very much work in progress, but I'm really excited about. So today I'm going to be talking about what is known as bilingual language control. So basically what this means is how bilinguals manage to stick to one language without making unwanted wrong language mistakes. So being a bilingual seems kind of hard. For everything, almost everything they know, bilinguals have not one, but two labels. And so they have to pick which one of them they use in each situation. On the other hand, we also know that they don't just flip a switch and forget that they know one language. Both languages remain active even when one language is spoken. Well, you can say being a bilingual is hard only in your little mind, Iva. Being a bilingual is actually not that hard, as bilinguals will attest to. So bilinguals are mental jugglers. Bilinguals switch languages effortlessly. They do code switching, whenever they want to, whenever that's going to be understood by their conversational partners. And perhaps that's something that's done in this environment. But when they don't want to switch, they don't. They say words in the wrong language very, very rarely. And so as an example of such a situation, let me put myself as an example. So my first learned, I don't know if it's still the best language, but definitely, one of my strongest language is Bulgarian. And so we all make speech errors, right? So if you speak Bulgarian, please let me know. I'll be super excited. But by definition, I assume that people in my environment here in the US and here in El Paso, they don't speak Bulgarian. So therefore, I'm not going to say anything in Bulgarian because I assume it won't be understood, right? The communication won't happen. But the thing is, we all make speech errors, and I'm one, like, God, I don't know how my students put up with me. I make a lot of speech errors when I speak in English. And so, things like saying chair instead of table, or saying, this is from an old corpus, as you can tell, but something like tip the cape instead of keep the tape. So I do these things within English all the time, but I never say anything in Bulgarian. Like I rarely, I would say in such a situation, probably about never, even by mistake. And I'm not, this is just a useful example. I'm by no means extraordinary, right? That's what bilinguals do. So how come? Broadly speaking, this is with mechanisms that are known as language control. So language control are mental mechanisms that allow bilinguals to control which language they speak, when, by regulating the availability in at each point, the kind of the prominence in the mind. So this language control, has no neural correlates. It's a network that involves the prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, the basal ganglia, and the inferior parietal lobule, and it involves working memory, attention, executive control, sort of selection. So understanding language control has to do with understanding how cognitive systems, so this kind of the bigger picture, understanding how language control works can help understand the interaction between the different cognitive systems. So interaction between language and attention and executive control. Also, understanding bilingual language control is helpful to understand the bilingual adaptation. So this is a very hot topic these days, right? The bilingual advantage, as it's commonly known. So whether it's an advantage or not, it seems there is some evidence for some cognitive and neural adaptations of bilinguals. So bilingual children have been found to outperform monolingual children on cognitive control tasks. So there's some effects, skipping to the last point on this slide. First, there are some difference between young adult bilinguals and monolinguals in, again, cognitive control tasks. Very, perhaps quite strikingly, bilingualism is also associated with cognitive reserve and with staving off symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So it doesn't, I think they're convincing demonstrations. It's not like it delays the onset of Alzheimer's disease, but it helps make the symptoms more mild. Which, so this is, there's, even if it were only for that, like that's a pretty useful thing to know about. And so bilingual language control is important because presumably that's what gives rise to all of these things. And just as an aside, I just wanted to mention, so the term bilingual adaptation, so this is not directly related to what I'm going to be talking about, but bilingual adaptation kind of assumes that what the default situation is monolinguals, and then bilingual is it's the special case, right? And then this is also very visible in how we organize our events, right? There's a special satellite symposium on bilingualism. And I always joke that I would like to see one on monolingualism. So, and I'm agnostic, maybe, maybe it's the chicken, maybe it's the egg, but I just wanted to throw this out there that maybe bilingual is the default state. Okay, so what do we know about language control? Well, we know that it's top-down and goal-driven. And by this, I mean, it's driven by an intention, right? So I want to speak this language and not that language, instead of just being kind of a passive, a more passive thing like priming. And at least in part, it's kind of controversial to what degree, but at least in part it's domain general. And by this I mean that the mental mechanisms that allow me to speak English right now and not Bulgarian are the same that help me make my coffee first thing in the morning and not perhaps tea, which comes later in the day. To what extent, though, it's debatable, but if it weren't domain general, if it were something specific to language, then it would be harder to explain these other adaptations that I was talking about. So there must be some degree of transfer. So here is an illustration of the most well-developed model of how bilingual language control works. So this is the inhibitory control model by David Green. Now you see at the top, there's the attentional system that sets the goal, speak language A. And then it sends an impulse to the sets of procedures that are necessary to carry this out, to speak English and not anything else. Then in turn, these sets of procedures, this language task schema, as this is called, regulates the activation or mental prominence of words in English and words in other languages. And so the words in English, get more prominence, and the words in this example, Spanish, get inhibited, get suppressed. So here the dotted line just represents another theoretical possibility. But this is the general idea of how this mental bilingual language control works. Now, usually, so at least many bilinguals don't have the two languages completely equally. One language is more dominant, and this is the language that the bilinguals in question have an easier time expressing themselves in and just speaking in and understanding. They feel more comfortable. And then there's the non-dominant language that it's more effortful to speak and understand. And so one of the core assumptions of these bilingual control models, and this one in particular about inhibition, is the dominant non-dominant asymmetry, which makes, it stands to reason. So the thing is, speaking a non-dominant language, of course, it depends how non-dominant it is. But let's say if I try to speak German to you right now, it's hard. I'm going to have a really hard time. And my dominant languages are going to want to jump out, right? It's easier to say something, it'd be easier for me to say something in English than to say something in German. And so there's going to be very strong interference. Therefore, very strong inhibition needs to be applied. On the contrary, when speaking a dominant language, that's why it's dominant, it's easy. And so a non-dominant language is likely not going to bother me very much. It's not going to interfere very much. And so hardly, if any, inhibition is necessary when speaking a dominant language. So the amount of inhibition applied is proportional to the strength of the language that's being inhibited. And so this dominant non-dominant asymmetry is what I'm going to be centering my talk today. It's the behaviorally visible part of bilingual language control. So the assumptions here are that a language takes time to recover from the inhibition applied. So the more inhibition, the more time then it takes to recover from it. So that's one. And then the stronger the language, the more it's inhibited. And so what this amounts to is that when we speak a non-dominant language, we inhibit the dominant, then the dominant is going to need to have to take an extra time if we need it again afterwards. And this is what I'm going to be showing you today. This is going to be sort of the center, the methodological part of my talk. There's a lot of evidence. So essentially, when you speak a non-dominant language, a language that you're having a hard time speaking, the dominant language takes actually a bigger hit than the other way around. Evidence for this comes from picture naming studies, the kind of disproportionate slowdown of the dominant language. Also verbal fluency tasks, when you have 1 minute to come up with, let's say, all the animals you can think of. And then you come up with fewer examples of a category if previously you've done this in your non-dominant language. And then also in paragraph reading, there were more mistakes reading in the dominant language of people. In that case, it was English, then the other way around. Just before I proceed, so this is the situation when I say dual language contexts. This is not, so code switching is a very different situation. And it's a different situation because there is no restriction, and people can go back and forth because they know that both languages will be understood. Now here I'm going to be showing you switching, people switching back and forth, but this is actually, we're telling them when to switch and when not to switch. And so this is, all of this is meant to study what people do when they don't switch. All right, so what are some open questions about language control? And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. The first study that I'll tell you about has to do with the question, how often is language control applied? Over and over, or just once? Then I'm going to examine the question whether this language control is really specific to bilinguals, or whether it's a more general cognitive mechanism. Then, so all of this basically is about words. And so I'll show you some work in progress that addresses the question whether there's a similar kind of control when we talk about syntactic knowledge. And then last, I'm going to be showing you some spontaneous speech data that I'm very excited about. So does any of this actually matter when people actually talk? All right. This is work with my undergraduate students, Andrea and Mac. Andrea graduated this past year. So imagine you have a bilingual that says something like, my friend just got a cat and it's the cutest cat on earth. My friend has always liked cats. Of course, the irresistible urge to Google a picture of a cute cat and put in the slides. So this study contrasts two possibilities about the application of control. You start speaking in a language, so you're making a language switch, and then you have to make sure the language you just spoke doesn't interfere. So you apply, in view of the previous model I showed you, you apply suppression, but that's it, job done. And then you proceed to speak. Or perhaps that doesn't do the job. And so you do it over and over and over. I wanted to mention, so I'm trying to stay theory neutral and avoid talking about suppression because there are other theoretical possibilities. So one of them is instead of essentially trying to push down the stronger language, the one that's not currently spoken, there is also, it has been suggested that maybe what you do is you actually give a boost to the weaker language when you speak it. And so I'm trying to stay theory neutral, but it's hard because the most developed theory is really that of suppression. So I guess I would use the term suppression, so suppression and control interchangeably. So the other possibility here is that we apply control over and over and over for every word we say. The gray part here and the contrast in the sentence between the black versus gray is just kind of to try and focus on how I'm going to be investigating this. But presumably, if it happens over and over, perhaps it won't be too much to say. It can happen on every word. And the evidence is mixed. So there have been only a few studies about this, and one shows one and the other one shows another. Now you can tell, well, isn't that a little bit far-fetched, right? So as I keep saying every single word, I keep pushing down all the other languages. So, if we take this ad absurdum, as Albert Costa, my former grad advisor, like to say, this means that we won't be able to speak at all, right? Because you would suppress your language so much that then it would be it'd take forever to resurface. Now that luckily doesn't happen. but there is some evidence that there are longer term consequences of language immersion on the dominant language. So people that go to live in a country speaking another language, then they go back to their home country, and they still show effects of that on their own first learned and dominant language. Okay, so here's how we address this. We had 101 participants from Spanish English bilinguals from the University of Texas at El Paso, dominant in English. So this is going to be the population that I'm going to be talking about today. So these are Spanish English bilinguals. They learn Spanish at home first, English a little later, probably age 4, like when they went to school, preschool. And then dominant in English, because we are looking for this asymmetry that I mentioned at the beginning. We determine dominance, so we do several things. We have a language history questionnaire in which we ask people to rate themselves on a bunch of variables, like how good they are in understanding or speaking, and how often, with whom, how often do they code switch. But we use, to determine dominance, we use an objective measure, which is the multilingual naming test, which is a productive vocabulary test. So it's similar to the Boston naming test, except it was rated for 4 languages. So people name at their own pace a set of 68 pictures that become more and more difficult. And so they start with hand and dog and tree, and then they end with these items. So I encourage you to think about how many languages you know, what these are called in. So the task that participants did was picture naming. So they just see images, they did a bird, bed, egg, ball. And there were 3 phases. So in phase 1, people spoke English. In phase 2, they spoke Spanish. And in phase 3, they spoke English again. So what this is supposed to be doing is name pictures in the dominant language, then switch to the non-dominant, and then again to the dominant. And we're going to be looking for the after effects of the prior speaking of the non-dominant language. So the after effects of inhibition, as I showed before. So naming in phase 3 is supposed to be delayed relative to phase 1 because of the Spanish in the middle. Then, to address the question that we set to investigate, we had 3 different groups. The 3 different groups, so phase 1 is always the same. What differed was phase 2. So we had a group that spoke Spanish for a long time, a medium time, and a short time. And they differed really in the length during which they spoke Spanish, but not the overall length. That's why we asked them to play Pac-Man in the middle. And then I felt really bad for the first group that didn't get to do this. So the logic here, then in phase 3, everyone does the same. The logic here is that if the time to recover from previously applied control is proportional to the strength of that control, that means that the longer the non-dominant language is spoken, the more and more over and over control is exercised, then recovery afterwards should be that much harder. So this leads to the prediction that in phase 3, the dominant language should be most delayed. So it should be delayed in all cases, but it should be most delayed after the long block, right? That would necessitate a longest recovery. A little bit less in the after the medium block, and least in after the short block. Now, if control is applied only once, then block length shouldn't matter. Okay, and here's what we found. So again, on the y-axis, response time in milliseconds or naming latencies. And then here on the right are the predictions as a reminder. So here's what we found. Essentially, it made no difference. So our results looked more like the only ones, then the other the over and over possibilities. Now you can ask, so how do you know that this is actually a result of uh, language control? I mean, so in any case, if people name the same objects over and over, they should get they should get faster, not slower, right? But just to convince you that here really we are looking for something that's specific to bilinguals, we also had a group of bilinguals, but then they all named the pictures in the same language, in English. And as you can see here, the pattern is very different, right? So people in phase 3 actually did get faster, right? Because they're naming in English only. So there was more to this study. There were more manipulations and more results that I don't have time to go into today. But overall, the data are a lot more consistent with the application of control only once. Okay, so on to the next study that I wanted to share with you today. So is language control specific to bilinguals, or does it reflect a more general cognitive mechanism? And this is a study with Caro Hernandez, who graduated a few years ago. So here's a little bit of context for this. It's not like monolinguals don't have this problem completely. So how come would you say, monolinguals only have, the monolinguals who mostly or only speak one language on a daily basis, they don't have two languages, so what are we talking about here? Well, monolinguals still have to choose what word they say when. So when to say Dalmatian versus dog, also when to say, so to pick the appropriate register, so when to say cool, when to say nice. And then perhaps, so another application, we know that in a conversation, people establish these so-called conceptual pacts when they agree on what to call particular entities. And so generally speaking, the entities around us have names that we all agree on, but some of these conceptual pacts can be very idiosyncratic. And one of them, so a good example for this that really cracked me up is couple speak. I was reading this article, and so it turns out that many people with their significant others, they establish a very particular sort of code that they refer to things. And so this here, if you start reading, a few months ago into our relationship, my boyfriend and I started adding funny sounding syllables to the beginning of words. So hug became higgle-hug, bed became bibo-bed. And so it's also very interesting how they apply this Igbo rule, right? So that's like, I immediately made a mental note. That's what I want to study at some point as well. So if you do this, then clearly, so you say sometimes they're not even that transparent. I mean, Bibo bed's still a bed, right? But let's say you use a completely, I think in later in the article, there's like instead of how was this, like it was really not transparent. So basically when you speak to your significant other, calling objects with weird names, and then you speaking to a friend immediately afterwards, you can't, so for the better of you, like you also would be probably very ashamed, and so you would want to inhibit that name that you just used and call it with a regular name such as dog. So this is the question that we are exploring here. Can within one language, even you don't have the daily practice of speaking two languages, can you use that same kind of top-down control mechanisms within language? Okay, so let me show you how so this topic of language control, this is one of the types of study that is most commonly used to study this. So I will show you some pictures. Please name each picture. So please name each picture in English as quickly and as accurately as you can. Are you ready? 3, cheese, bird. All right. In this part, please name each picture in Spanish. or any other language as quickly and as accurately as you can. And if you say, wait, I don't know any other language, my usual line is, 3 words from one language and you're a bilingual. You're on that continuum. So here are, any other language than English. Vestido? All right. So now the fun begins. In this part, you have to switch between the English and the other language names. So red is English and blue is the other language. Wait, and I immediately forgot. Okay, tree, vestido, horse, bird, caballo, dress, queso. Uy. So if I can't even do my own experiments, then so here's what this experiment looked like. One block in one language, the next part in another language. The third part, switch unpredictably. Then again so A, B, B, A, right? So block 4 is in the second language and block 5 is in the first language. And this is what's called a sandwich design. So in this study, there are Spanish-English bilinguals from UTEP that name pictures in English and Spanish. We had a group of non-balanced bilinguals, so this population that I was telling you about, dominant in English. And then we also tested a group of balanced bilinguals for good measure, but I won't be showing these data today. I do have them if you're curious. And then we tested monolinguals. And today, so we tested 2 groups, and today I'll be showing you the group of monolinguals that was from UTEP that we think is most comparable to the bilinguals. And so what did they switch between? They switched between pictures with basic level names and subordinate names. So they would see similar pictures and they would be instructed to name them with a kind of a common name, dog, and the most specific name they can think of. There was one round we went over everything so there was a familiarization phase. So we made sure that they knew the specific names. They knew what to call everything. And then they did exactly the same thing as I just showed you, but instead of switching between English and Spanish, they switched between calling these images with words like dog and with words like Dalmatian. And so here's the logic. We are going to be looking for one effect that is known to be, so to speak, a signature of language control mechanisms in bilinguals. And this is the so-called mixing costs. This is the delay, the cost associated with naming pictures in a mixed block where you switch all the time relative to when you do only one thing. And in the mixed blocks, we are taking those trials on which you actually didn't switch languages immediately. So you don't switch, but you're in this part of the experiment in which you have to switch constantly. And this is always associated with a cost. Right? Because you're kind of maintaining, you don't know what's going to come in front of you, and so you're maintaining readiness in 2 languages. So this difference, this delay in mixed relative to single naming blocks is known as the mixing cost. But here's the cool part. These mixing costs are asymmetrical, such that regularly, when you don't have to switch languages frequently, your dominant language, the red dot here, is faster than your non-dominant language, as you might predict. But then when you perform the mixing task, you see that the dominant language actually takes a much bigger hit than the non-dominant language. And so the logic here is that we are going to be looking for this asymmetry also for monolinguals, for the names. Is there such an asymmetry for dog relative to Dalmatian? Do the dog type names take also the bigger hit as the dominant language. This is what we're going to be looking for. And here is what we found. So these are the bilinguals, the non-balanced bilinguals. And again, this is a complex data set. There's a lot to talk about, but today I'm going to focus on the mixing costs, right, that I just showed you. So you can see very nicely here this asymmetrical shape, right? The lines are not parallel. And on the right, you can see that indeed the cost for the dominant language was actually more than the cost of the non-dominant language. And so now, what is going to happen with the monolinguals? Here's what it looks like. So focusing on the panel on the right, you see that it looks very similarly to that for the bilingual. So the red bar is higher than the blue bar. We are agnostic as to whether it should be as much or not. It happens to be a little more for the bilinguals. But the important part is that the dog type names, the names that are more frequent, familiar, more widely used, are actually taking the bigger hit in this particular situation. Now, if you look at this, so here are the two plots for comparison. And now on the bottom here, on the bottom right, I have plotted the magnitude, by how much do dominant names get disadvantaged from the beginning to the end of the experiment. So this is the difference between the red and the blue, so the blue and the red at the beginning. And the difference, you can see that for the end, it gets smaller by approximately half. And then the same is true for the monolinguals. They start out at about equal, and then by the end of the experiment, the basic level names actually get slower. Now you can you're probably thinking, wait a second, you're not being completely straightforward here. The shape for the monolinguals and the bilinguals, it's flipped, right? So for the bilinguals, the dominant is faster, and for the monolinguals, actually it turns out that the non-dominant is overall faster. So this is interesting in itself, but we figure, so I don't have time to go into this right now, but I'm pretty convinced this is due to other factors. It's not about how strongly represented these words are, so not what's dominant and non-dominant, and also doesn't have to do anything with control. It's basically because of how we chose our stimuli. So the bottom line here is that the names that are dominant, right? The dog and book, and shoe versus sneaker. It was book versus dictionary, flower versus tulip. So those names actually over time, when they keep being mixed, get slowed down by approximately the same amount as the dominant language for bilinguals. So as I just showed you, dominant names for monolinguals take a bigger hit when mixed with non-dominant names. And this is hard to explain. You also have to take my word for this, but it's hard to explain with the bottom-up mechanisms that are usually applied for monolingual lexical selection. So it's not like I'm the first person that asked this question, that there's a lot of work talking about interference resolution in monolingual lexical selection. But the type of mechanisms, quite interestingly, is actually completely different. So pretty much all of them don't apply a mechanism that has any component of intentionality to it, like a top-down mechanism. And with this work, of course, much more work needs to be done. But I would like to suggest that these top-down language control can also function within language. Now, the fact that it can doesn't mean that it does all the time. I'm also well aware that whatever it is, bilinguals will do more of it, because monolinguals would only have to do this within language, whereas bilinguals have to do it within language and across languages, right? So if anything, it would be a matter of degree. Okay, so the next part, I wanted to talk about control over structure. This is work with Andrea and Ale. Now, as you can see from the work that I just showed you, when people talk about bilingual language control, they mostly mean, they're not mostly, entirely mean lexical interference resolution. That's what language control means. And in this set, so this is a work in progress, some of the ongoing work that we're doing in my lab. So the question behind this work is, well, is there a similar type of language control over structure? Now, one influential theory says that bilinguals share syntax between their two languages. So what this means, and there might, so there are different possibilities, but this means that, let's say if I want to say the cat crosses the street or el gato cruza la calle, uh, the knowledge that I have, the knowledge that I use to do this, and I'm quite agnostic as to what that knowledge is, some like procedural component, uh, but that knowledge is one and the same. And somehow I know that I can use it for both English and Spanish, as opposed to having it once within the Spanish, like this is Spanish, and then the same kind of knowledge I have it for English. So instead of two copies, I just have one. That's the sense of this theory. So if that were the case, then we might expect that language control can only operate over knowledge that isn't shared across languages, because I can't apply control over over the same stuff that I actually might need to use because it's one and the same across the two languages. So I only have the option to apply any kind of control or suppression over those things that are not shared. Now, very anecdotally, that actually that control is needed, and actually there are failures. So one thing that I always somehow forget that I can't do in Spanish, and I drive myself into a syntactic corner, is ending a sentence with a preposition. So I always want to say something like, he's very easy to work with. And then I start, so those of you who speak Spanish, no es muy fácil de trabajar con. No, you can't say this. I completely can't say this. But by always somehow I start and like, oops, no, that doesn't work. So some kind of control is necessary. Now, here we wanted to see whether it's actually applied in a similar way to the way it's applied over words. So for this, we used a structure that we assume is non-shared between English and Spanish. So both English and Spanish have the prepositional dative. Clara gave a present to her son, or Clara dio un regalo a su hijo. But only English has the double object. And this is just an assumption here. I know that actually some people have different views. So Clara gave her son a present, but at least at face value, you cannot say in Spanish, Clara dio su hijo el regalo. This doesn't exist. We also assume that these mean roughly the same thing. And again, I know that they don't mean exactly the same thing, but convey the same sort of transfer of possession meaning. And so what we did in this experiment, so first we asked participants to look at the situation where people speak English and they have to say something with a double object structure. So Clara gave her son a present, and then they had to say something in Spanish that was completely unrelated. And then, so presumably, if that worked in this way, they speak Spanish and they're like, nope, you can't say double object, right? So there's some kind of control exercise. In one of the possibilities, no matter what you say in Spanish, you suppress the double objects because you know you can't use them. And so if that were the case, then what happens when you switch back to English and you happen to want to say something else with the double object structure, like the shop assistant was showing the woman the dress. And so this is the logic of this study. So we had phase one, and we asked people to produce names with English datives, and we primed them with the double objects beforehand, so they would produce at least some double objects. Then in phase two, they named pictures with monotransitive structures in Spanish, but so anything else, but in one of the views no matter what they say in Spanish, they would be suppressing the English non-shared structures, and then they switched back to English, and then they had to name to describe a series of pictures with datives again. And so the predictions are that if control worked in a similar way to the way we know it works in lexical access, then in the group of interest, after having spoken Spanish in the middle, if the double objects are suppressed, then they would take time to resurface, to recover from that inhibition, and we might expect that they would be used less frequently after switching back to English. We had another group, a control group, that only produced English throughout the experiment. So for that group, that shouldn't happen. Conversely, if it doesn't work that way, we should find no difference. And here is what we actually found. So so far, no difference. There is a slight hint, but so we are about 2/3 done with participant recruitment. We did this online since the pandemic. So far, we don't have any evidence for control of structures. This is so people produce no less double objects after they spoke Spanish than when they spoke only English. Now this so far we have no evidence for control structure, but this is work in progress. The next thing we are planning to do is having prepositional datives in phase 2 in Spanish. So not just speaking any Spanish, but saying the relevant structure in prepositional dative, and then seeing if that's going to do anything to the double object. And ideally, we also wanted to have with the same participants in the same experiment. We also wanted to have individual word naming, like I showed you before, just to compare the whether the effects would be present. Okay, so the last part that I wanted to share with you today, we come to the spontaneous speech data that I'm very excited about. Work with my undergraduate student, Kyle Wolf, who did amazing stuff with this data. I basically salvaged this study. So the question behind this work is, are there control after effects in spontaneous speech? So, the vast majority of this literature is, since 1999, has been done in the way that I showed you in parts 1 and 2 with lexical selection, so picture naming. And the effects are extremely robust overall. And so the question here is, do they manifest in the same way when we actually talk? If so, then the strong prediction would be that we would be delayed, right? So if it takes longer to switch back to the dominant language after the non-dominant, so assuming we don't have a choice of what to say, like we're told speak this language versus that, then there should be something like that visible in when we say more than just single words. And so the strongest prediction of this literature is that people's speech rate would be delayed after they speak Spanish. So after they speak their non-dominant language and then they switch to their dominant language. Other signs of lexical retrieval difficulties, right, of lexical retrieval delays, would be more pauses, either silent pauses or filled pauses, like or so people would become more disfluent when they switch. When they switch in general, but most clearly seen from the non-dominant to the dominant. And then perhaps lexical retrieval delays would also maybe mean that they would just say fewer words, because if they're delayed in accessing them, maybe they just say fewer words. Apart from that, we also looked at average word frequency that people used, and vocabulary richness or lexical diversity. And we are also planning to look at how many cognates people use, or these words that are similar between the languages, like guitar, guitarra. And finally, also grammatical complexity. So one way to look at this would be just to count the number of clauses. So here's what the experiment looked like. There were 86 Spanish-English bilinguals dominant in English, and then they watched videos. This is probably one of the most fun for participants experiments that we have ever done in my lab. So they watched a video, which was like a Tom and Jerry type cartoon, but from a Russian from the 80s, the kind of stuff that I grew up with. And so they watch one video, and then they immediately have to explain it to the experimenter. Then they watch another video, and then they have to explain its contents to the experimenter. The crucial manipulation is that for two of the groups, the first video had to be explained in Spanish and the second in English. And for the remaining two groups, both of the videos were explained in English. And then for two of the groups, they explained the same video, once in English, once in Spanish, or once in English and the same in English. And for the remaining two groups, they explained different videos in the two phases. So this is all between subjects. These are all for different groups. And here's what we found. So first, I'm going to show you the results for speech rate, broken down by language of prior video and video, whether it was same or different. So here we are only looking at English production. The second video was always in English. What could differ was the previous video, whether it was in the same language or whether it was in the different language. And so there was nothing. There was perhaps a slight suggestion in the different video condition, but there was no significant effective speech rate. The rates were similar. The next thing we look at was pauses, so unfilled and filled pauses. And here also there was no effect. The next thing we look at, so we looked at several different things. So we looked at total number of words. We looked at the number of unique content words. So this is a measure of lexical diversity. So the more unique content words, the better. And so both of the top graphs, higher is better than lower. In the bottom graph, it's better, quote unquote. The bottom graph, it's the other way around. So the bottom graph looks at frequency, and there lower is, so lower frequency means, kind of more, more rare, interesting words than higher. So not just calling entities with thing and stuff. And here is what I'm going to show them at the same time, but I'm going to take some time to let you appreciate the results. So the first one, total number of words, orange is prior English, blue is prior Spanish. So the prior Spanish groups said on average fewer total words than the English. So all of these things that I'm showing you here did have a significant effect. Similarly with the number of unique content words. So both Spanish groups said fewer unique content words in subsequent English than the people who never switched languages. And then the frequencies of the effect was the other way. Well, it was in the same, it was in the predicted direction, where people who spoke Spanish beforehand used words of higher frequency, so easier words, than people who spoke Spanish, people who never switched languages. And so so you can say, well, but these are different people. How do you know? Now, sure, And this is a first of hopefully a number of a series of studies exploring this topic. I already have a bunch of ideas, but a little bit more confidence is given by the fact that it's two of the groups that behaved in the same way, and it's all in the predicted direction. So to wrap up, after speaking their non-dominant language, bilinguals produced in their dominant language fewer unique content words, higher frequency words overall. Now, this is also a pretty crude measure, so we're going to break this down, and fewer words in total. And we didn't find effects for speech rate and pauses. Now, of course, the fact that we didn't find them that doesn't mean that they're not there. In fact, there was some numerical hints, but these were so what we know right now is that these effects are possibly weaker than for these other perhaps less predicted effects that we got. So the strongest predictions of the control theories were actually not supported in our data set. So what we conclude from this is that there definitely are control effects in spontaneous speech, and perhaps this is useful to know. So even you can imagine things like people going to therapy or a neuropsychological assessment, and so they just chat with their relatives in one language, and then they go and they're probably going to be, well, not probably, but at least in some cases they might be examined in their dominant language, and so it's useful information that can actually, performance can get affected by this language switch. So this was not, our results were not strongly consistent with the theoretical predictions and the prior results from single word production, although there's a lot more work to be done there. But perhaps tentatively, I would like to put out there the idea that perhaps this reflects some sort of compensatory measures. So I guess producing connected speech is dynamic, and there are a lot of things that are likely going on in how over time things get constructed and negotiated. And so perhaps what we tentatively see in our data is that instead of being more disfluent or speaking more slowly, instead of our bilinguals weren't more disfluent, but then they just used fewer and easier words to maintain fluency and speech rate. Okay, so today I showed you that language control showed you some evidence that language control is applied once only, that it's not unique to bilinguals. I didn't show you any evidence for the fact that it functions over structure, but this is very much still to be investigated. And then I showed you some evidence that it has effects in spontaneous speech. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
I guess John is busy. So thank you for that wonderful talk, Iva. So I guess we can open the floor for some questions. So you can either do the questions via the Q&A option, or you can just raise your hand, and I guess I'll be the one to call the names. So we have some questions in the Q&A right now, so I'll go ahead and read the questions. So Julie has a question. Julie Boland has a question. So she said, in experiment 4, in cartoon description, and experiment 1, picture naming, I was expecting the suppression effect to be strongest at the switch point and diminish as the person continued speaking in the dominant language. Is that what you would predict? If so, can you see that in the data?
So this is a great question that I feel I don't have a good answer to. But this is very much something Kyle, who I believe is here in the audience, he can attest to that. I was telling him that we have to look in our spontaneous speech data. So my prediction would be that it dissipates it dissipates over time. But it is the case. It is the case, and I'm like, so I'm really sorry because this is striking to me now how I haven't looked at this earlier. So I definitely agree, but I will email you next week with that.
I got kicked out briefly. I'm supposed to be running this. I apologize to our participants, Dr. Ivanova. I also want to take a quick moment to say thank you.
John, you got muted.
I'm unmuted. Thank you. I'm offering my own applause, which I missed a moment ago. I want to take a brief aside to speak to our participants to say that everyone here is invited to informal Zoom reception that we'll be hosting after we're done with the question session. And I'm right now posting a link into our chat to that reception. Let me do this.
Sorry, I just want to say before, I actually had, I remembered something else that I wanted to answer in response to Julie's question whenever.
Please do that now, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So no, I just remember. So I remembered one study in which they didn't look what happens over time, but they did. So they found the suppression effects present after 10 minutes. So what they did was they did a language mixing experiment, and then they saw that as I was showing you today, the dominant language was the one that took the bigger hit. And then they waited 10 minutes, and I again did a naming session, and then the dominant language still had those. And so this would kind of be inconsistent with the fact that it dissipates over time. On the other hand, I mean, it should at some point, right? So again, I will look at my own data and let you know.
So Marlise has a question. She said, "Thank you for a great talk. Could you tell us more about the criteria for deciding that a participant fell in the non-balanced bilinguals group? Did you find a continuum of proficiency levels among participants?"
Thank you for that question. So each of these criteria, so we try to be strict just to make sure that we are dealing with a uniform population. But bilingualism is not a matter, it's not a matter of putting people into one box or another box. So to answer your question directly, our criteria, so in the one experiment that we kept that criterion most strict was in the second study that I showed you. And there you had to name on average, be able to name 30 more pictures. So approximately half. So your vocabulary in English is half as large as your vocabulary in Spanish, of course, with our little 68 item test. So this was our provisional definition of being non-balanced. In practice, it's really much not a matter of that. And so especially here in El Paso, we have bilinguals with many different language histories. And so my intention for the future would be to study this as a continuous variable. And again, this is here. It's great because it really our students here, our population, lends itself into this continuous analysis.
Okay, so our next question is from Sarah. Her question is, regarding languages, we have different theories in literature theory. For example, we have structuralism, post-structuralism, or hermeneutics. In which literature theory would you place language control and why?
So to be honest with you, I don't want to say something off the top of my head on this. So I guess I would have to, I don't believe I'm off the top of my head fully familiar with the difference between these approaches. So this is one that I would get back to you afterwards.
Great, and we have a question from Savi. So she said, "Thank you so much for an exciting talk. I'm curious about the findings for control over structure. Can you tell us more about where in the sentence/response you measured the latencies? I'm curious if we might not find slower production as we do with word level effects, but maybe other types of differences in how processing or planning unfolds." So yeah.
So just to clarify the method for this one, we actually didn't measure response times. This was a method. I mean, I don't want to say novel because there's nothing, there's nothing that drastically novel, but it's not about how fast, it's about actually whether you say it or you don't say it. And so this is actually, so you may make a fair point. This is something that hasn't been studied in lexical studies. And so now that we're just trying to approach in some way the whether control exists over structure, because perhaps my impression from structural priming studies that I have done a bunch in my life, the measuring latencies is not a very sensitive method, just because there's a lot going on in saying a sentence, and so that's why we chose to do it this way, where we were predicting a decrement in the production of double objects instead of a delay necessarily. But we also have, we are setting up right now a lexical experiment to make sure, so the main question here is, so this control, does it influence not only your speed, but also your actual production choice? Like, do you say, are you more likely to say couch versus sofa because of these control processes? And so looking at the spontaneous speech data, the answer to that might be maybe, yeah. But we do, in a sense, we do need a demonstration in picture naming studies like we've done. But in any case, we should, it won't hurt, and we will do this in future work. It won't hurt to measure latencies in this work. And the one thing that I just wanted to add about this is also I do realize that it's quite, perhaps I can't help but think like this is a pretty crude measure that we are using, right? So it's not, kind of like, maybe things are not binary in this way that we're trying to make them binary. And so this is just, given that, to my knowledge, there is really nothing that looks at this. This is just our first approximation. We're just trying to get that ball rolling and then develop our methodology there.
Okay, so we also have another question from Helens. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, but the question is, back to the way in which balanced bilinguals were identified. Would the context in which subjects learned and used their languages be reflected in the vocabulary that they use? For example, language of everyday, childhood, family in Spanish, abstract academic concepts in English, but not Spanish.
Yeah, no, this is another way. So again, like I was showing you things here, like basically putting things in boxes for the most part, like this is this and this is that. And we already know that this bilingual experiences are a multifactorial experience where there are a lot of different things that matter. And so for what that's worth, I would say, perhaps in the lexical studies, we used words that should be, I want to say, if at all, there were words that were sort of equivalently used across contexts, that might be those that we use, but then that might even not be the case. So we had, like the book and shoe, but you can make the argument, yes, but perhaps, shoe is used more in Spanish at home, and book is used more in school, for example. So so we didn't look at this in our data, but this is also something that we are planning to find a way to look at, and then also this can be estimated with different questionnaires that, so we can ask people these questions and then see whether it predicts aspects of the data. Now one other just experience that might perhaps modulate bilingual effects, that a former, so an alumnus at our undergraduate program that is now faculty at UT Austin gave a talk just yesterday, and she was talking about language brokering. People who at a very early age in childhood, like maybe 9 or 10 years old, your parents are asking you to help translate some kind of important document because they can't read it in English. And so she was talking about the aspect. So basically, you're becoming like a simultaneous interpreter without choosing to do so. It can be very stressful, but it also shapes your language experience in a particular way. And so this is also something that we don't take into account in these kind of boxy studies that I just showed you. But this is also something that we this seems to be common in the area here, and this is definitely something that we can start looking into.
Okay, and there, Cecilia has another question, which I also have. We have a similar question. So can you tell us how you selected the lexical items? So we know from the literature that language dominance can vary across domains and / topics. So while you classify a bilingual as being overall dominant language A, it could also be the case that they are dominant language B for the specific topics or lexical items 50%. So yeah.
Yeah, no, and I get that. That's a really fair point. And I don't, like, I admit I don't have a good measure for that. I mean, so again, the things that they're explaining are general. We select the items like you would for a classical picture naming experiment, which is one, we make sure that they're not cognates across languages, unless we specifically want that. But in this particular case, we didn't. Just to kind of eliminate another level of cross-language influence. And then essentially, so in this, again, in the study that makes the parallel with the monolinguals, we were like, there were other concerns, kind of difficulties for stimuli selection. So it seemed, so those stimuli were kind of limited by what we could do with the monolingual stimuli. And so they didn't really, so basically they were pretty insensitive to this point that you're now raising, which I agree is a really good point. The monolinguals, that was kind of an interesting realization for me, that it is really hard to pick pictures that can be equally felicitously called with both a basic level and a subordinate name, because the minute you would call, so you would call it with a basic level name, and perhaps an example of that would be birds. Yeah, most people won't talk about a sparrow, but then or here willows, in El Paso, there are not that many of them. So you would say tree, but then for everything else, as long as you see the spots, you're going to say Dalmatian. And there's some, on kind of the higher end of this, there's if you see a fish on a plate, that's going to be salmon. That's not going to be fish. If you see an owl, you say owl, you don't say a bird. And this is why we actually had this weird effect of this reversal, because our stimuli were just somehow eliciting that they were better for the subordinate names. But all this aside, I'm trying to think whether we have something in our data that could directly speak to this. And I don't have a piece of data to show to that. Again, I would assume, for things like maybe, cat, dog, so animals, perhaps you can make the argument that we draw concrete, in picture naming studies, we draw concrete entities from a number of domains. And in the non-picture naming study, the one with the cartoons, there was still, there were 2 animals, there were some fruit, there's some watermelons in one of the videos, or like the mice were making a cake. And then, so basically it's the same, I feel it's the same pool from which we draw to pick our stimuli for the picture naming studies. And then, if anything, perhaps they might be balanced, where, there's like, there are the buildings and fruit, animals, human professions like I don't know, the doctor or the king, whatever, these cartoons, and the classical, there's balls, so there are different household objects, and so hopefully that at least gives some diversity. So if people are more balanced for, so they're dominant for one in one, then they would be. Well, I hope you get the idea. That people are the dominance differs across category, and so ultimately it balances each other out.
Great. And Acrisio has a question. So he says, very interesting research. Thank you for this talk. You talked in particular about language dominance. How do you see the role of dominance shifting between language A and B depending on the domain of interaction? For example, home language, professional, academic domain.
I mean, in general, so I would say what and this is again kind of anecdotal impressions. It really would, like, I actually now as you're I'm really grateful for your questions, because I'm already thinking of a study that we can do to directly address this. So essentially where we counter, when we oppose people's, so where we find different patterns depending on the domain in which we investigate by the same people, right? So if I make them talk about a particular thing, then they show an effect towards, let's say, dominance in English, and then the same people, we ask them to talk about a different thing, and now they show dominance in Spanish. So in general, I mean, many people here regard, so the school and work is, so the professional environment is English. Many people are dominant in English. It seems across their environments, but some people use Spanish to speak with their families, with their parents, with their relatives. Some people also have relatives across the border. In fact, we also have a population that daily, well, a year ago they came from Juarez to for school or work, and then they go back. Some people at some point just move because it's easier, but then their families are in Juarez. So El Paso and Juarez, it's quite a, I can talk more at reception, but it's a really fascinating place where it's really one thing with a line in the middle. So that there is no, and like I can see, from the university, I there's a freeway and then there's Mexico, right? So there is no physical separation. And so yeah, so I would assume household things, like more the domain of, I don't know, cooking maybe, or I don't know, the fruit and vegetables from my stimuli, right? That would be more something that people are perhaps more dominant in Spanish, and some other kind of more academic related concepts that would be they'll be dominant in English. But this is again, yeah, this is again something that we, like, again, I'm grateful for this question. We haven't really explored that here, and yeah, no, it makes me think about a different study, but it's not directly related. So the different contexts, we need to do more work.
John.
Yeah.
John has a question.
I wonder if we can, there's a question that came up in your first experiment, where you were talking about, or you showed evidence that there's sort of this inhibit once sort of a way in which the system might be working. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what is being inhibited, or what evidence we have. Is it a lexicon? Is it some subpart of a lexicon? Is it some supra part? Is it the grammar? Is a language a single category in the, like, where are you, or where's the field on that? Like, what is being inhibited? What category of thing?
So actually, great question. Thank you for that. What exactly there's there's several possibilities, but ultimately there's open questions. So let me just show you. I wanted to so share screen real quick. Where is this slide? And then I wanted to go back. Actually, I should have done, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to go back to the model because it will be easiest to explain with this graph here. So can you see that? Cool, yeah. So basically, I think both of those things you said. So the assumption of inhibition is that, so and you know, as illustrated by this model, is that on the one hand, when you speak one language, kind of your whole other language gets inhibited. So speak English inhibits speak Spanish. And this is known as global inhibition. And so this is something that we were trying to use in the third experiment about structure, that when I speak, no matter what I'm saying in English, my Spanish is going to be, or no matter what I'm saying in Spanish, my English has to be inhibited, the whole English. But then there's also the assumption that each individual word is inhibited. And so kind of like, as I'm saying dog, and this again, this is one particular view of these things. It's just that it's the one that's most widely developed. So every time I say dog, this reactively, this intention reactively inhibits the word perro. So after I had the intention to say dog, then the word perro is going to be inhibited, and this is known as local inhibition. So over individual lexicosemantic representations. And there is some evidence in, you know, coming from this type of experiments that I showed you, but there is some evidence for this distinction, that it can happen globally, it can happen locally. So the one, right, sorry, the one thing that I wanted to add to this, which I mentioned that when I was talking about structure, is that there is a lot more to a language than the lexicosemantic representations, and so far these theories are silent about this. And so, and kind of informally chatting with the people, I don't know if you know, like Rob Hartzucker from Ghent, and so you know, he said, oh no, I don't think that inhibition actually works over structure the same way it works over lexical items. But this is, you know, people have investigated whether kind of what's the interaction of the syntactic systems of bilinguals, but not whether control operates in this way. And so that's what, well, I guess that's what I set off to start investigating, that there's a lot more, right? And there's also phonology. Like earlier today, we were talking about kind of accent errors where, you know, I'd say perro and instead of perro. And I have anecdotally, I've done this. And some, you know, so there are these dissociable levels, but really these models so far don't address that, which is great because there's more work to do.
Thank you. Fascinating. There's no written questions in the queue. We are nearing the end of our allotted time, but if someone does have want to raise their hand or post something, we probably have time for one more question.
And just in the meantime, is there any way, I really would like to have a record of these questions, and then there was already one that I have to respond by email. So is there any way, is this downloadable, or can you save it?
Yeah, I think we can find a way to save the chat and the questions. I'll take a screenshot of the questions, and at the same time, the recordings will be on our department YouTube channel. So the video recording of this one. So yeah.
Nice, yeah.
I'm not seeing any other questions now. So I want to remind everyone that you are invited to a virtual Zoom reception, which the link is posted in the chat. Is the link posted in the chat? Did it come through?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. There is a link in the chat. I should be in that room, I think, at 5:45 Eastern time. BYO, whatever. But okay, so that's the virtual reception. But please join me in thanking Dr. Ivanova for our absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a treat.
It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Great time. Thank you so much. I'll see everyone a little bit later.
Thank you.